So here is what happened 30,000 years before Christ, when everything changed because one woman refused to watch good meat rot. Picture this. You are standing in what will someday be called Europe, but right now it is just endless ice, bitter wind, and your family trying desperately not to starve. The glaciers are advancing. Every winter lasts a little longer. Every summer brings a little less food. And here is the problem that is killing people. You spend 3 days hunting a mammoth, risk your life, finally bring down this massive animal that could feed your tribe for weeks, and then you watch most of it spoil within days. It rots. It becomes poison. You cannot eat it, and people die hungry, surrounded by meat they killed but cannot keep. This is the world Grey Moon was born into. Now, we do not know if that was really her name. The stories that survived 30,000 years tend to lose some details. But the legend is consistent across dozens of tribes, passed down through so many generations that the core truth has to be there. One woman watched wolves more carefully than anyone had before, and that changed everything. Grey Moon noticed something the hunters missed. After a successful hunt, wolves did not eat everything immediately. They buried the excess meat in snow and came back to it weeks later, digging it up and eating it like it was fresh. Now, humans had been trying to save meat forever. They would hang it high in trees, away from scavengers, pile rocks over it, do whatever they could think of. Nothing worked. The meat always spoiled. Always. It was just how the world worked, as inevitable as sunrise. But Grey Moon thought, what if it is not inevitable? What if the wolves know something we do not? So she convinced her tribe to try something that probably sounded completely insane. Take this fresh mammoth meat, this precious food that took days to hunt, and pack it into glacier ice instead of eating it right away. Just trust that it will still be good later. The tribe was skeptical. Of course they were skeptical, but hunger makes you willing to try desperate things, and Grey Moon was persuasive enough, respected enough, or the situation was dire enough that they agreed. Weeks later, they dug out that meat, and it was still good. Not just edible, actually good. This single moment, this one successful experiment, sparked a revolution that enabled human survival through the absolute worst period of the Ice Age. Because once people realized that decay was not inevitable, that you could actually fight it and win, everything changed. Suddenly, women all over the northern regions started experimenting, observing, testing different methods. Now we need to talk about the 3 major discoveries that came out of this revolution, because they happened in different places, by different people, solving the same problem in completely different ways. First, the ice keepers of northern Europe. These women built on Grey Moon's discovery and got scientific about it. They learned through brutal trial and error that not all cold is the same. Meat frozen at certain temperatures lasted entire seasons. Meat frozen at slightly different temperatures became inedible within weeks. They could not measure temperature the way we do, obviously, but they developed incredibly precise methods. They knew that ice from certain parts of the glacier worked better. They knew that meat buried at specific depths stayed good longer. They created elaborate systems of ice houses and snow pits, each designed for different types of meat and different storage durations. Second, the salt gatherers along the Mediterranean coast. Their discovery came from disaster. After a massive storm flooded their meat storage area with seawater, they assumed everything was ruined. But days later, when they finally got around to throwing it all away, they noticed something strange. The meat covered in sea salt had not rotted. It smelled different, tasted different, but it was completely edible. They started experimenting with deliberate salt preservation, and within a generation, they had transformed coastal life. Storm-washed meat went from tragedy to treasure. Third, the smoke women of Central Asia. This discovery was entirely accidental and came from what everyone thought was a terrible mistake. During a particularly harsh winter, families moved their meat storage deeper into caves to protect it from scavengers. Their cooking fires, burning constantly for warmth, filled these storage areas with thick wood smoke. When spring came and they finally checked on the stored meat, expecting to find it spoiled, They discovered it had been perfectly preserved. The smoke had done something to the meat that made it last far longer than anyone thought possible. The race was on to figure out exactly what and how to control it. But here is what nobody tells you about these early discoveries. The cost. The human cost of figuring this out. Entire families died from botulism before women learned to recognize the warning signs. There was this sweet smell that preceded deadly spoilage, but they only learned that after people died. The salt finder, a woman whose name survived in stories specifically because her technique worked so well, lost half her tribe's children one winter because she used the wrong type of mineral salts. Not sea salt. Not the right kind of rock salt, something that looked identical but was actually toxic. Think about what that means. These women were experimenting with their families' lives. Every new technique, every small variation, could mean the difference between survival and death. They could not test these methods in some safe laboratory. They had to cut the meat, apply the preservation technique, store it, wait, and then feed it to their children, hoping they got it right. Through this systematic observation, through this incredibly dangerous process of trial and error, prehistoric women developed the first food safety protocols. They learned specific cutting techniques that prevented contamination. They discovered the critical timing of when meat could be safely preserved after a kill, too soon. And certain things went wrong. Too late. And different things went wrong. They memorized the visual and olfactory signs that indicated successful preservation versus the signs that meant this batch would kill you. These early preservation pioneers established entirely new roles within tribes. Before this, you had hunters, gatherers, tool makers, and shamans. After this, you had preservation keepers, and they held status equal to the most respected hunters and the most powerful shamans. Because here is what happened. The tribes with good preservation keepers survived harsh winters. The tribes with poor preservation keepers died. It was that simple. Natural selection was not just selecting for the strongest hunters anymore. It was selecting for the women who could keep meat safe. By 25,000 years before Christ, preservation knowledge had become so valuable that entire political structures formed around it. Marriages were arranged specifically to secure these techniques, to unite tribes that had complementary preservation knowledge. Young girls began apprenticeships at age 7 to master this complex art. 7 years old, learning to identify dangerous spoilage by smell, memorizing the exact timing for different preservation methods, understanding which techniques worked for which animals and which seasons. This was not simple work. This was not women just salting some meat and hoping for the best. This was sophisticated, technical, dangerous work that required years of training and incredible attention to detail. These women were humanity's first food scientists, working without thermometers, without refrigeration, without any of the tools we take for granted, using only observation, memory, and courage to fight against decay itself. And they won. Against all odds, using nothing but ice, salt, and smoke, they conquered decay and enabled human survival through the harshest period our species has ever faced. That is where this story begins, with one woman watching wolves and the revolution that followed. Between 20,000 and 10,000 years before Christ, something extraordinary happened. Those simple preservation techniques we just talked about, they evolved into something nobody could have predicted. We are talking about sophisticated operations that would not be matched again until the Romans showed up thousands of years later. Let me tell you about the Great Salt Road. This thing stretched from the Dead Sea all the way to the Black Sea. And it was not just a road. It was an economic lifeline, a political force, and the foundation of the first truly large-scale trade network in human history. And here is the remarkable part. Women led the caravans. Women controlled the trade. Women held the power. Salt was worth more than gold. Actual gold. Because you could not eat gold, and you could not use gold to keep your family from starving through winter. But salt? Salt was survival itself. The women who controlled salt sources controlled everything. Now we need to talk about the daughters of smoke, because these women took preservation to an entirely different level. Up in the Pyrenees, they perfected a 17-day smoking process using specific combinations of oak apple, and juniper woods. Not just any oak, not just any apple wood, specific varieties, harvested at specific times, dried for specific durations. Get any piece of this wrong, and the meat would not last. Get it right, and you had meat that stayed good for over 2 years. 2 years. Think about that. In a world where most food spoiled within days, these women created meat that could last longer than most people lived. They guarded these secrets more carefully than any military strategy. The wood mixture formulas, the exact timing, the temperature control techniques passed only to chosen daughters through memorized songs. Not written down. Songs. Because songs could not be stolen as easily as written documents, and songs encoded the information in ways that outsiders could not understand. The rhythm told you timing. The pitch changes indicated temperature shifts. The lyrics described which woods to use. It was brilliant, and it was absolutely necessary, because everyone wanted these secrets. This period saw the rise of something we would recognize today as industrial centers, except they formed around preservation instead of manufacturing. The Great Salt Cave of Hallstatt became humanity's first real industrial operation. 300 women worked there in organized shifts, extracting salt, processing it, grading it by quality, and trading it across enormous distances. These women were not just mining salt, they were conducting research. They discovered that different salt concentrations created different preservation effects. Heavy salting preserved meat longer but made it incredibly salty and hard. Light salting created better flavor but shorter storage life. Medium salting with specific timing hit a sweet spot that balanced taste and preservation. They experimented with adding herbs and learned that certain combinations prevented specific types of decay. Rosemary stopped one kind of spoilage. Thyme prevented another. Sage worked for something else entirely. And here is something that sounds like superstition but turned out to have a basis in reality. They believed the moon's phases affected how well meat absorbed salt. Modern food scientists have actually found some evidence for this. The moon affects water retention in biological tissues. These ancient women, through careful observation over generations, noticed patterns we are only now beginning to understand scientifically. The control of preservation resources became so valuable that it sparked warfare. The Brine Wars lasted 3 generations and completely reshaped tribal boundaries across Europe. These were not quick raids. These were prolonged conflicts over natural salt springs, with alliances forming and breaking, territories changing hands, and entire populations relocating to secure access to these precious resources. Meanwhile, in completely different parts of the world, other women were solving the same problems in radically different ways. In the Arctic, the frost mothers developed permafrost caches. They learned that if you buried meat deep enough in permanently frozen ground, it created natural refrigeration that worked year-round. They mapped out the exact depths where permafrost started, identified the best locations where the ground stayed consistently frozen, and created elaborate cache systems that could store meat for entire years. In warmer climates, where ice and permafrost were not options, women got creative. They discovered that honey worked as a preservation agent. Completely submerge meat in honey, and bacteria cannot grow. They learned to use clay. Coat meat in specific types of clay, let it dry, and it created an airtight seal. They used rendered animal fats, discovering that if you packed meat in fat and sealed the container properly, it stayed edible for months. Then came one of the most important accidental discoveries in food history: fermentation. Someone stored meat with wild garlic and salt, probably trying to improve the flavor. When they came back to it weeks later, the meat had developed this tangy, sharp taste. It looked different, it smelled different, and everyone probably assumed it had spoiled. But someone brave enough or hungry enough tried it anyway, and it was not only safe to eat, it was actually good. Better than that, it lasted for extraordinary lengths of time. This discovery changed everything because fermentation worked in climates where other preservation methods failed. Too warm for ice preservation? Fermentation worked. Not near any. Salt sources? Fermentation worked. It was adaptable, and it opened up preservation possibilities in regions that had struggled with food storage. Within a few generations, hundreds of regional fermentation techniques developed, each one adapted to local bacteria and climate conditions. What worked in cold mountains did not work in hot valleys, so people learned to use different starter cultures, different timing, different ingredient combinations. This massive diversity of techniques spread across the world, and we can still see their descendants in foods today. Korean kimchi, German sauerkraut, Italian salami, every fermented food tradition traces back to these early experiments. By 12,000 years before Christ, a complex preservation economy had emerged across the inhabited world. Women controlled food security, and that meant they held unprecedented political power in their communities. This was not ceremonial power. This was real, practical power. The woman who could keep your family fed through winter had more influence than the strongest hunter, because strength did not matter if everyone starved. Preservation specialists traveled between communities, trading techniques and knowledge. They established the first professional guilds, organizations that set quality standards and protected trade secrets. They created apprenticeship systems that could last decades. They developed the first quality control processes, with master preservers inspecting and grading products before they could be traded. The most successful preservation specialists became wealthy in ways that are hard to comprehend. They controlled resources everyone needed. They possessed knowledge everyone wanted. They could name their price, and people paid it because the alternative was starvation. These women established preservation schools, where students paid enormous sums just to learn basic techniques. Advanced methods cost even more. The most closely guarded secrets were priceless. Competition between preservation schools grew intense. Really intense. Industrial espionage emerged. Students would infiltrate rival schools, pretending to be legitimate apprentices while actually spying for competitors. They would memorize techniques, steal samples of preservation mixtures, even bribe junior students to reveal secrets about timing and methods. Some schools developed elaborate security measures. They would teach different students different parts of the process so that no single person except the master knew the complete technique. They used code words and symbolic gestures that changed regularly to identify legitimate members versus infiltrators. This was high-stakes stuff, because your preservation technique was your livelihood, your family's security, your legacy. If a rival learned your methods, they could undercut your prices, steal your customers, destroy your reputation. The most successful preservation masters took their most valuable secrets to their graves, never writing them down, never teaching them to anyone except perhaps one chosen successor. The sophistication of this era is staggering when you really think about it. These were people without writing systems in most cases, without any scientific instruments, without any formal education as we understand it. Yet they developed preservation techniques so effective that we still use fundamentally the same methods today. They created economic systems, political structures, and social organizations that would influence human civilization for thousands of years. This was the golden age of preservation, when women who conquered decay built empires on knowledge, skill, and the absolute necessity of keeping food safe. Between 10,000 and 5,000 years before Christ, preservation techniques crossed a threshold. They stopped being just practical knowledge and became something else entirely. Sacred mysteries, divine gifts, religious practices, wrapped around food science in ways that were both fascinating and incredibly effective. The Temple of the Salt Goddess in Anatolia is where we need to start this story. This place housed priestesses who claimed their preservation methods came directly from divine revelation. These were not just women who knew how to preserve meat. They were religious authorities who performed elaborate rituals around every step of the preservation process. The meat had to be cut at sunrise, not dawn, not morning, sunrise, the exact moment when the sun broke the horizon. Salt had to be applied while chanting specific prayers in a precise sequence. Storage areas needed blessing with burning sage before any meat could be placed inside. Every step had ceremony, ritual, religious significance. Now, here is what makes this so interesting. While all of this appeared purely religious, these rituals actually encoded crucial food safety practices. Cutting meat at sunrise meant you were working in cool morning temperatures before bacteria could multiply rapidly. The prayers that had to be chanted while applying salt, they took exactly the right amount of time to ensure even salt distribution. The sage burning that blessed storage areas? Sage has antimicrobial properties that actually helped prevent contamination. These priestesses were not fooling themselves or anyone else. They were brilliant. They had figured out that if you wrapped essential food safety practices in religious ritual, people would follow them exactly, every single time, without question. Miss a step in a regular recipe, and maybe your meat spoils. Miss a step in a sacred ritual, and you have offended the goddess. Which instruction are you more likely to follow precisely? The priestesses tracked their success rates on clay tablets. We have found these tablets. They are humanity's first quality control records, documenting batch after batch of preserved meat, noting what worked and what did not, recording environmental conditions, tracking outcomes over years and decades. This was not mysticism replacing science. This was mysticism encoding science in a way that ensured its preservation and transmission. This era produced the most innovative preservation techniques in human history. Let me tell you about some of them. The wind mothers of the Mongolian steppes created something extraordinary. They cut meat into strips so thin you could almost see through them, then hung them in specific locations where wind patterns were just right. Not too much wind, which would dry the meat too quickly and make it brittle. Not too little wind, which would let it spoil before drying completely. Just right. The meat that came out of this process could be stored for years, and when you needed it, you could rehydrate it with boiling water and have meat that tasted nearly fresh. Think about the knowledge required for this. They had to understand wind patterns well enough to predict how air would flow through their drying structures. They had to know the exact thickness to cut meat, so it would dry evenly without spoiling. They had to time everything perfectly based on temperature and humidity, and they did all of this without instruments, using only observation and experience passed down through generations. The cavewomen of southern France developed temperature-controlled aging chambers that would not look out of place in a modern charcuterie. They used underground rivers to maintain constant humidity and temperature. They learned that certain caves had specific environmental conditions that created unique flavors in preserved meat. They experimented with aging times and discovered that meat aged for different durations developed different characteristics. Some caves produced meat that was ready in weeks, others required months. The cave women mapped all of this out, creating a sophisticated understanding of how environment affected preservation and flavor. But the most remarkable technique came from the desert daughters of North Africa. These women figured out how to preserve meat using nothing but scorching sun and dry sand. No salt, no smoke, no ice, just heat and dryness. This sounds impossible, right? Everything we have talked about so far involved keeping meat cool or using salt or smoke. But the desert daughters discovered that if you prepared meat correctly and exposed it to intense, dry heat in the right way, you could create preserved meat that lasted for months. The precision required for this technique was extraordinary. Cut the meat too thick, and the outside would dry while the inside spoiled. Cut it too thin, and it would burn before drying properly. Expose it to sun for too long, and it became inedible. Not long enough, and bacteria would survive. They had to know the exact thickness for different types of meat, the precise number of days for each stage of the process, and the specific environmental conditions needed for success. Each of these regional techniques required specialized knowledge that took years to master. A preservation expert from the Mongolian steppes could not just walk into the North African desert and use her techniques successfully. The environment was too different. The methods had to be adapted to local conditions, and that adaptation required deep understanding of both the technique and the environment. This specialized knowledge became the foundation for long-distance travel and trade. You could not just wander off into unknown territory hoping to find food. You needed preserved food that could last for months, and you needed to know it would still be safe to eat when you needed it. The invention of pemmican revolutionized this. Pemmican was genius, a concentrated mixture of dried meat pounded into powder, mixed with rendered fat and dried berries. It was incredibly calorie-dense, practically indestructible, and could last for years without refrigeration. A person could carry enough pemmican to survive journeys of thousands of miles. This single innovation enabled human migration on a scale that had never been possible before. Explorer traders carried preservation techniques across continents, creating the first truly global exchange of food technology. A technique developed in Northern Europe would make its way to Central Asia, where it would be modified and improved, then carried to the Mediterranean, where it would be combined with local methods, then eventually make its way back north in a completely transformed version. This cross-pollination of ideas accelerated innovation dramatically. Women who mastered multiple preservation techniques became wealthy beyond anything we can imagine. They were not just experts in one method. They understood ice preservation and salt curing and smoking and fermentation and sun-drying. They could look at any piece of meat, assess the available resources and environmental conditions, and choose the optimal preservation method. This flexibility made them invaluable. These multi-technique masters established preservation schools that became centers of learning and innovation. Students paid enormous sums just for the opportunity to study. Basic techniques might cost a few valuable trade goods. Advanced methods could cost everything a family owned. The most closely guarded secrets, the techniques that produced the longest-lasting or best-tasting preserved meat, were taught only to the most promising students who could afford the astronomical fees. The rivalry between preservation schools grew so intense it bordered on warfare. Schools would bad-mouth their competitors, claiming their techniques were inferior or dangerous. They would spread rumors about contaminated batches from rival schools. They would poach each other's students with promises of better training or secret techniques. The competition drove innovation, sure, but it also created an atmosphere of paranoia and secrecy. Industrial espionage became a serious problem. Rival schools would plant spies, who would spend years in deep cover, working their way up through the ranks of a competing school until they gained access to valuable secrets. Some schools responded with elaborate security measures. They would teach different aspects of their techniques in different locations, so no single facility held all the knowledge. They used code words that changed regularly. They created tests to identify spies, asking questions that only legitimate students who had been through the entire training program would know how to answer. The most valuable secrets were never written down. Master preservers would teach their most advanced techniques only to one or two chosen successors, passing the knowledge verbally, making the student demonstrate mastery again and again until every detail was perfect. When a master died without passing on her knowledge, entire techniques could be lost forever. This era represents the absolute peak of preservation culture. These women had transformed simple food preservation into an art form, a science, a religion, and an economic force. They had built social structures, educational systems, and trade networks that spanned continents. They had created a body of knowledge so sophisticated that it would influence food practices for thousands of years to come. And all of it, every single bit of this incredible achievement, came from women refusing to accept that decay was inevitable. They looked at meat spoiling and said no. They experimented, observed, refined, and perfected techniques that conquered one of humanity's oldest enemies. They built empires on knowledge and skill, and in doing so, they changed human history forever. Around 5,000 years before Christ, everything started to change. Cooking was not new. Humans had been cooking food for hundreds of thousands of years, but something shifted in how people thought about meat. The gradual adoption of cooking as the primary way to prepare meat began to transform food preservation, yet here is what is remarkable. The ancient techniques did not disappear. They persisted, evolved, and continued to shape human civilization in ways we are still discovering. The last pure preservation masters, women who had never cooked meat in their entire lives, knew they were the end of something. They were living links to 30,000 years of accumulated knowledge, and they understood that this knowledge might die with them if they were not careful about how they passed it down. These final keepers created elaborate initiation ceremonies that could last months. An apprentice did not just learn techniques, she lived them. She would spend weeks learning nothing but how to recognize safe meat by smell, more weeks learning the feel of properly preserved meat, months memorizing the exact timing for different processes. The ceremonies were designed to embed this knowledge so deeply that it became instinct, not just information. They also created preservation manuscripts using pictographs and symbols. We have found some of these manuscripts, and honestly, many remained undeciphered until modern times. The symbols were not straightforward. They encoded information in layers. A simple drawing of a sun might indicate time of day, temperature, duration, or all three depending on context. A wavy line could mean water, humidity, or a specific type of spoilage pattern. These manuscripts were deliberately obscure, designed to be understood only by those who had received the proper training. But here is what nobody expected. These techniques spread far beyond their original purpose. They influenced practices that seem completely unrelated to food preservation. Egyptian mummification, for instance, borrowed heavily from meat preservation techniques. The Egyptians used salt. They used specific drying processes. They understood that removing moisture prevented decay. Where do you think they learned that? From thousands of years of women preserving meat, Roman garum, production. That fermented fish sauce that became so valuable in the ancient world came directly from fermentation techniques developed by prehistoric preservation masters. The Romans did not invent fermentation. They inherited it, refined it, commercialized it, but the basic knowledge came from women who had been fermenting meat for thousands of years. Viking food preservation methods that enabled their legendary voyages across the Atlantic. Those techniques trace back to the ice keepers and smoke women of northern Europe. The Vikings did not figure out how to preserve food for months-long sea voyages on their own. They inherited sophisticated preservation knowledge that had been developing for 25,000 years. The transition period between pure preservation and cooking-dominated food culture saw some fascinating hybrid techniques emerge. Women discovered that if you partially cooked meat before applying traditional preservation methods, it created entirely new flavors and textures. The partial cooking killed surface bacteria, which meant the preservation process could focus on long-term storage rather than initial safety. This extended storage life even further and created products that were actually better than either pure preservation or pure cooking alone. The great preservation markets of Mesopotamia became incredible centers of innovation, where techniques from across the known world came together. A trader from the north would bring ice preservation knowledge. Someone from the coast would share salt curing methods. A traveler from the east would demonstrate smoking techniques. And the preservation masters in these markets would experiment with combinations, creating hybrid methods that were more effective than any single technique alone. These markets were not just places to buy food, they were universities, research centers, and innovation hubs all rolled into one. Young preservers would travel hundreds of miles just to spend time in these markets, watching, learning, trading knowledge. The cross-pollination of ideas that happened in these spaces accelerated the evolution of preservation techniques dramatically. The social structures that had been built around preservation, the women's guilds, the quality standards, the trade networks, all of this became a template for other crafts and industries. The way preservation guilds organized themselves, trained apprentices, maintained quality control, and protected trade secrets became the model for metalworkers' guilds, potters' guilds, textile workers' guilds. The preservation masters had essentially invented the professional guild system that would dominate skilled trades for thousands of years. Even as cooking became the dominant way to prepare meat, every culture retained sacred preservation traditions. Certain festivals required preserved meat prepared in the old ways. Specific celebrations demanded traditionally cured products. Important rituals involved preserved foods that had been made using methods unchanged for millennia. People did not necessarily remember why these traditions existed or where they came from, but they honored them, unconsciously keeping alive the legacy of women who had conquered decay. Modern DNA analysis of preserved foods found in archaeological sites has revealed something extraordinary. Some samples, meat that was preserved thousands of years ago using these ancient techniques, remains theoretically edible today. Not that anyone is volunteering to eat it, but the chemical analysis shows that the preservation was so effective, so complete, that the meat has not significantly decayed in thousands of years, That is the level of sophistication we are talking about. Think about what these women achieved. They enabled human migration to every continent. Humans could not have spread across the world without the ability to carry food that would last for months or years. Every time someone crossed a desert, sailed across an ocean, or ventured into an unknown territory, they relied on preserved food created using techniques these women developed. They built the first cities. You cannot have cities without food security. You cannot have people specializing in crafts and trades and administration if everyone has to hunt every day. The ability to preserve food, to store it safely for long periods, to trade it across distances, that is what made civilization possible. They freed humanity from the daily hunt. Before effective preservation, you had to find food constantly. Every day was about survival. After preservation techniques became widespread, people could think about other things. They could develop art, music, philosophy, mathematics, all of the things we consider civilization, because they were not spending every moment worried about where the next meal would come from. The techniques these women developed through careful observation, through dangerous experimentation that sometimes cost lives, through generations of refinement and improvement, these techniques remain fundamentally unchanged today. We have better tools now. We have thermometers and refrigerators and scientific understanding of bacteria and chemistry. But the basic principles, ice preservation, salt curing, smoking, fermentation, sun drying, all unchanged. Every piece of jerky you eat, every cured ham, every fermented food, every pickled vegetable, all of it traces back to these unnamed women who refused to accept spoilage as inevitable. They looked at the fundamental problem of decay and decided to fight it. And they won. Their legacy is not just in the food we eat, though that alone would be significant. Their legacy is in the social structures they created, the economic systems they established, the knowledge transmission methods they developed. They showed that careful observation and systematic experimentation could solve problems that seemed unsolvable. They demonstrated that women could hold economic and political power through specialized knowledge. They proved that human ingenuity could triumph over nature's inevitable processes. We do not know most of their names. Grey Moon might be legend or might be real, but either way, she represents thousands of women whose names are lost to time. The Salt Finder, the Daughters of Smoke, the Wind Mothers, the Cavewomen, the Desert Daughters, these are collective names for countless individuals who each contributed something to this massive body of knowledge. But their work survives. Every time someone makes beef jerky or cures a ham or ferments vegetables or smokes fish, they are using techniques perfected by women 30,000 years ago. Every time someone stores food safely for their family, they are benefiting from knowledge bought with experimentation, observation, and sometimes tragedy. The women who conquered decay changed human history more profoundly than most of the kings and generals and conquerors whose names fill history books. They made civilization possible. They enabled human expansion across the globe. They created the first scientific methods, the first quality control systems, the first professional guilds, and they did all of this while fighting against one of nature's most fundamental forces. That is their legacy. That is what they gave us. And it is a legacy that continues every single day, in every culture, in every place where people preserve food and keep their families fed. The first food scientists were women who refused to watch good meat rot, and thank goodness they did.